There's something I've noticed over the years, and the more leaders I work with, the more convinced I become that we don't talk about this nearly enough because we celebrate being trusted. We celebrate being dependable. We celebrate being the person people can count on. And honestly, we should. I mean, those things matter. But I think somewhere along the way, many leaders quietly cross a line they never intended to cross. You see, at some point, being trusted stops being leadership and starts becoming a trap. And I don't mean that in a cynical way, but I don't think most leaders arrive there because they're controlling or arrogant or even power hungry. Actually, I think the opposite is true. Most leaders care deeply. They want things done well, they want to serve people, they want to protect what they've built. They want to create something meaningful. And because of that, they become reliable. They become trustworthy. They become the person everyone naturally turns toward. And and every time everyone around them learns something. I mean, it's where the answers live. It's where certainty lives. Relationships are built there. The final blessing typically lives there. You know what I'm talking about. And little by little, something begins happening that most leaders don't even realize while it's unfolding. The role begins consuming the person. You see, being needed starts feeling the same as being valuable. So leadership slowly becomes identity. And I think that's dangerous because we were never created to derive our worth from the roles we inhabit. In fact, I don't believe we were ever meant to confuse what we carry with who we are. Those are two very different things. I mean, there's who God created you to be, and then there are the roles that you inhabit. We all have different titles at some time in our lives, whether it be leader, business owner, executive, mother, father, husband, wife, son, daughter. But I really feel like those are assignments, and those are those are stewardships, or those are expressions, right, of identities that we hold, of roles that we fill. But they are not who you are. They are what you do, right? And somewhere along the way, I think many of us forgot who we were before we became anything else. So before you were a leader and before you became successful, before you were responsible for everyone and everything, before all of those titles and labels and expectations were put on you, or you assumed, or you began to operate under. Before all of that, you were just you. And I think that's why so many leaders wake up one day exhausted. And they really can't fully explain why. There's just this tiredness that we seem to embody. It's because they didn't see it happening. They slowly disappeared into the role: leadership, business owner, wife, husband, father, mother, daughter, son, something. And it wasn't intentional and it wasn't malicious. but they became so committed to what they were carrying, those roles, that they lost sight of the person carrying it. And eventually, identity and responsibility became so intertwined that it's difficult to tell where one ends and the other begins. Which is why stepping away feels so terrifying for so many of us. And I don't think the fear is really that the business won't survive. I think it runs much deeper than that. Because underneath all of this sits a question most people never say out loud. And that is, who am I if I'm no longer needed in the same way? Oh, that question really hits. Because somewhere along the journey, we've conditioned ourselves to believe that being needed means we're valuable, that being appreciated means we're worthy, or that being indispensable means we're loved. And if we don't have those labels to point to, then who are we? You see, now we're not really talking about leadership anymore. Now we're talking about identity. We're talking about presence. We're talking about trust. And we're talking about the subtle ways performance can slowly replace being. Because leadership is a role, and it was never supposed to become your identity. And maybe that's why certain phrases become so normal that we stop questioning them. In fact, one of the things I've heard leaders say for years, and honestly, I've said it myself, I'm sure more than once, and it's this very statement, and you've likely said it too. It's just faster if I do it myself. Now, I know on the surface that sounds pretty reasonable. I mean, sometimes it's true, or at least we believe it's true. Because when you've built something, when you've done something 100 times, when you've made the mistakes and learned the lessons, of course, it feels faster. It feels easier. It probably even feels safer. But the more I've sat with that statement, the more I've found myself wondering if it's really a productivity statement or if it's something else entirely. Stay with me here, because I don't think I can just do it myself faster is always about efficiency. Think about how we usually say it. Oh, I can just do it myself faster, right? It's often said out of frustration. Something isn't meeting an expectation. Something isn't being done the way we would like to do it or have it done. Something isn't moving as quickly as we'd like. So we've all said that before. I can just do it faster myself. And I think that sometimes that frustration is actually armor masquerading as excellence. And I don't say that with judgment. Again, I've said that very statement myself. I say that with compassion because I think most leaders genuinely believe they're protecting something. They're protecting quality. They're protecting standards. They believe they're protecting the reputation they've worked so hard to build. Maybe they think they're protecting people from making mistakes. At least that's what we tell ourselves. I know I have before. But underneath all of that, I find myself asking a really much deeper question. What are we really protecting? Because sometimes I wonder if we're not protecting excellence at all. But maybe we're protecting the identity we've built around being excellent. Or maybe we're protecting the image we've created of ourselves. Maybe we're protecting the role, or we're protecting the mask. Because when our identity becomes wrapped up in what we do, different starts feeling threatening. And I don't mean because it's wrong or because the other person isn't capable, but it's more like because different forces us to confront something inside ourselves. And I know that that can be very uncomfortable. Because if someone else's way works, then maybe our way isn't the only way. Oof, that can be a gut punch. Hit me right in the chest sometimes. Because sometimes I want what I want and I want it my way. But if our way isn't the only way, perhaps we've attached too much of ourselves to being the one with the answers, the one who catches things or the one who fixes things, maybe the one who makes sure everything turns out just right. But here's the question that keeps coming back to me. Is it really faster? Because think about what it cost. Think about the energy it costs. Think about the time it costs. Think about what it teaches. Because if you take it back and do it yourself, yes, you may finish faster in the moment. That is true. But you've also guaranteed that the person you took it from will need you again next time. And eventually, without even realizing it, we begin moderating the mask. We start managing everyone and everything around us to preserve the image that we've created. Not because we're trying to control people, but because we're afraid. And there's nothing wrong with the fear. Sometimes we're afraid of being wrong or losing relevance. Sometimes we're afraid we're no longer going to be needed. Because if being needed has become the place where we derive our value, then protecting the role starts feeling like survival. And once survival enters the room, armor follows. Which is why I don't think I can just do it myself faster is really a productivity statement. I think it's a confession. A confession that somewhere along the way, we've become so identified with what we do that we've forgotten who we are without it. And perhaps that's why what looks like excellence on the outside can sometimes be fear underneath. And fear has a way of spreading. It doesn't typically stay contained, which raises another question. What are we teaching when we say, I could just do it myself? Because you know, in your head, that's how you hear yourself saying that out loud. And even if everything always comes back to us because it's faster, what are we creating? And I think that's really the question. What are we creating? Because the truth is, we're always teaching something, and not just with our words, but with our patterns. Think about that we're teaching something every time we have a reaction with what we reward or what we rescue, with what we repeatedly take back. But perhaps even more importantly, we're teaching with the energy we bring into every moment. What are we leading with? What are we teaching before our words are ever heard? Because I don't think most leaders realize what they're teaching. I know they're not trying to create fear. I know they're trying to help, trying to be supportive. They're trying to make things easier, or at least that's what we tell ourselves. But easier for who? Easier for the person or easier for the leader? Because what I know is that people are always learning. And over time, they begin learning something. And it's not because anyone said it out loud, but because it was felt. Because energy precedes language. Presence precedes instruction. And fear precedes your words. So again, what are we teaching when we show up in leadership? Because it depends on whether we're showing up from presence or from performance. Are we teaching people to trust themselves? Or are we teaching them to wait for someone else's approval? Are we teaching them that different means wrong? Are we teaching them that their way isn't enough simply because it isn't our way? Because there is a difference between protecting excellence and expecting people to become extensions of ourselves. And that's where things become dangerous. Because eventually, people begin learning that nothing is really complete until the leader touches it. So that means they begin learning that safety lives outside of themselves. And that's really heartbreaking because I don't think leaders intend to actually teach that. But too often, that's exactly what's felt because feelings become beliefs. And if we're not careful, we'll impart our feelings until they become someone else's beliefs. And beliefs become identities. And identities become patterns. And patterns become culture, which means culture is never just what we say. Culture is what we repeatedly reinforce. And before anybody realizes it, people begin seeking externally what was always meant to be cultivated internally. I'm talking about trust, confidence, courage, conviction. And perhaps that's the deepest loss of all. Because when someone else's certainty becomes louder than your own, you begin doubting yourself. You begin second guessing yourself. You begin holding your breath. Oh, in anticipation and wait. And it's not because you're incapable, it's not because you're unqualified, but because you've slowly been taught that certainty lives somewhere outside of you. And maybe that's why fear spreads, because fear teaches fear. Just like trust teaches trust, which means that uncertainty inside the leader eventually creates uncertainty around the leader. And maybe that's why this matters so much, because we're not just teaching people how to do tasks. We're teaching people how to see themselves. We're teaching people what to trust. And perhaps even more importantly, we're teaching people where certainty lives. And perhaps that's what happens when people learn where certainty lives, because they bring everything back. Again, not because they're incapable or because they're lazy or because they don't care. It's most likely because they've learned where the answers are. That's what's been taught. That's what we're teaching. They've learned where the blessing is or where the safety lives. And eventually, without even realizing it, leaders begin stepping in. Not because they're trying to control people, it's because they're trying to help, because they care, because they don't want people to struggle, because they don't want them to make mistakes, because they want to protect them from disappointments. And on the surface, that sounds loving. In fact, most of us could call that love. But I think there's a question we don't ask nearly enough. What if protection and interference aren't the same thing? Because I don't think leaders realize that every time we rescue someone, we interrupt something. We interrupt their confidence, their trust, their courage. We interrupt their ability to stretch or to fail. And If people never have the opportunity to fail, then where is the learning? Where's the growth? Where's the discovery? Because every time we step in too quickly, or too soon, or too often, we're not just protecting them from disappointment. We're actually stealing opportunities for them to uncover what they're capable of. And I know that's hard to hear because most leaders don't rescue people because they're manipulative. Most leaders rescue people because they care about them, or at least they believe they do. But maybe there's something deeper happening. Maybe we're not protecting them. Maybe we're protecting ourselves. Maybe what we call love or compassion and caring is sometimes fear wearing very noble clothes. Because fear is sneaky like that. Fear is sneaky. Sometimes fear calls itself helping or mentoring. That's a good one. Fear calls itself protecting. Sometimes fear even calls itself leadership. And because our intentions are good, we rarely question our interference. But growth requires breath, right? Growth requires space. Growth requires mistakes. It requires us to stretch. And if we're constantly stepping in before people get there, then what are we really protecting them from? Are we protecting them from failure or from becoming? And maybe the deeper question is this: where did we learn this from? Because perhaps somewhere along the way, someone interrupted our becoming. Perhaps someone taught us that certainty lived outside ourselves. Or perhaps someone stepped in too quickly and rescued us. And without ever realizing it, we've spent years repeating patterns that we inherited and never questioned. Have you thought about that before? Because that means that maybe the leader that's interrupting someone else, maybe that leader is interrupting someone else's becoming, is also interrupting their own. Because becoming doesn't stop when we become leaders. Right? Becoming who we are doesn't stop when we become CEOs or when we become parents or when we become advisors. I mean, we are all still becoming. And perhaps the greatest gift a leader can give someone isn't rescue. Maybe it's room. Room to try, to struggle, to stretch. Oh, room to fail. As hard as that is, maybe what is needed is room for them to astonish themselves, to really discover there was far more inside them than they knew. Because healthy leadership doesn't rescue people from every hard thing. Imagine how exhausting that is. Oh, wait, if that's something you've already been doing, then you know how exhausting that is. Healthy leadership trusts that what God is developing inside someone doesn't require our constant interference. Because sometimes what we call protection is actually interruption. And every interruption costs something. And not just for them, but for us. Perhaps the hardest part of all of this is realizing that everybody loses. Because when leaders become the final blessing, when everything has to come back through them, when their thumbprint becomes the thing everyone is waiting for, there's a cost. And I don't think most people realize how much is being lost. Because the people around them slowly begin losing their confidence. They start losing trust in themselves. They stop listening to their own intuition. They begin holding their breath. They hesitate more often. They second guess themselves. And perhaps the greatest loss of all is that they stop being astonished by who they could have become. Because if someone else is always stepping in, always rescuing, always providing the answer, then people never fully discover what was already inside them. And that's heartbreaking. But I think that the leader loses something too. In fact, I think the leader loses far more than they realize. Because somewhere along the way, they began confusing the role with the person. And titles are not people. Roles are not identities. Those things change. But who you are at your core remains. And yet over time, many leaders slowly stop recognizing the person underneath the role. They no longer know who they are without being needed, without being the answer, without being the fixer, without being the source. And man, can I just tell you, that's exhausting. It's no wonder we feel exhausted all the time. Because no human being was ever meant to carry that kind of weight. No human being was ever meant to determine another person's worth. And yet, somewhere along the way, that was likely done to us. And because it was done to us, we inherited the pattern. We adopted the habit. And without ever questioning it, we began teaching the very thing that exhausted us. Oh my gosh. Let that sink in for just a moment. We began teaching the very thing that exhausts us. Because patterns that are not questioned become patterns that are repeated. And perhaps that's why everyone becomes exhausted. Because counterfeit sources exhaust everyone involved. And maybe that's why so many leaders wake up one day feeling lost. It's not because they failed. It's not because they've done something wrong, but because they've forgotten who they were before they became anything else. You've forgotten who you were before anything else came along, because it's before the titles, before the responsibilities, before the expectations, before everyone needed something from you. Before all the labels and the roles that we carry now. Because before all of that ever came about, they were just themselves. And maybe that's the deepest loss of all. Not time or freedom or energy, but identity. Because somewhere along the way, they slowly drifted away from themselves. And I think the hardest part of all that is this. Deep down, we know. I think deep down we know when we're losing ourselves. Deep down we know when we see less and less of who we really are and more of the identity that we've created. We know when we're performing. We know when we're hiding behind the armor. We know when we're staying busy because the stillness feels too vulnerable. And underneath all the noise and all the responsibility and all the expectations is someone we haven't spent time with in a very long time. Someone we've stopped trusting, someone we've stopped listening to, someone that we've stopped believing. It's ourselves. And maybe that's why we struggle to trust others. Because we've forgotten how to trust ourselves. And because we've forgotten how to trust ourselves, maybe we've also forgotten how to trust because we've forgotten who we are. Because when you forget who you were before you became anything else, you begin trying to become something you were never meant to be, the source. And perhaps that's why everyone is exhausted, because source was never ours to hold. And because source was never ours to hold, maybe that's the thing I've been wrestling with the most. Maybe leaders don't become the system because they're controlling. Maybe they became the system because they care, because they're capable, they're reliable, because people trust them. And because of that, they slowly became the place everyone looks. And if we're being honest, there's a part of us that likes that. Because it feels good to be needed. It feels good to be valued. It feels good to be trusted. Until one day we wake up so exhausted, wondering why the heck everything still depends on us, right? We wake up wondering why we feel so heavy or why we feel so lost. We wake up wondering why we no longer recognize the person we see in the mirror. And perhaps the answer isn't more leadership. And perhaps it isn't better systems. It's definitely not trying harder. But maybe the invitation is much simpler than that. Maybe it's just about remembering. Remembering that before you were a leader, you were a person. Before you were responsible for everyone else, you were already loved. Before the titles, before the expectations, before the roles, before the applause. Before people needed you, you needed you. You already had value. You already had worth. You already had purpose. And it's not because of what you do. It's because of who you are. And because of who created you. Because when God created you, He didn't create you lacking. He created you whole, with value, with worth, with trust. He created you with courage, with everything you needed to become who you were created to be. And perhaps that's why leadership was never meant to become your identity. It was just meant to become an expression of it. Because who you are and what you do are not the same thing. Maybe that's the question we all need to sit with. It's not whether we've become indispensable or whether or not we've become successful. It's not even whether or not we've become respected. But I think it's whether we've become so identified with the role that we've forgotten the person underneath it. Because maybe the deepest question isn't, have I become the system? Maybe the deeper question is, have I forgotten who I was before I became everything everyone else needed? And if the answer to that question is yes, it's not failure. Maybe it's an invitation. An invitation to remember, to trust again, to come home to yourself, to come home to your faith, to your presence, to come home to your being, to come home to the part of yourself that existed before the titles and the expectations and all of the responsibilities. Because leadership is a role. It was never supposed to become your identity. And perhaps that's where the healing begins. Or perhaps maybe you've been trying to carry something you were never meant to hold. And maybe that's why you're tired.
Leadership isn't what you perform, it's what you embody. If this conversation resonated, share it with someone ready to lead differently. And remember, when your faith ignites your fire amplifies your frequency. Until next time.